so-called homeland. For Armenians, the diaspora was the source of wealth and ideas that stimulated organization and self-awareness within the communities left in the Ottoman Empire. Now, when the Armenian question was first raised about 150 years ago, Armenians both in the diaspora and the Ottoman and Tsarist empires had not yet formulated any consensus on what their political future ought to be. There was no agreement on whether Armenia would be independent, like Western European states, it'd be sovereign, or it would be autonomous with some local rights within the multinational empires. And the nationalist movement that developed in the late 19th century divided on this and other issues. So there was never a consistent or totalizing Armenian political vision. The first political party, the Hunchaks, were in fact a Marxist socialist party. The more powerful party that developed, the Dashnag Sutun, the Dashnags, in fact, talked about Azad Hayastan, which was a vague term, means free Armenia, that could mean independence, but eventually would be deliberately meant to mean autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. After 1908, the Dashnags and eventually the Hunchaks would give up the idea that they would be independent. After the Young Turk Revolution, their idea was that they would work within this empire, collaborate with the constitutionalist movement, and live in a multinational empire. So there were these divisions between these parties. There were divisions between Eastern and Western Armenians, between Armenians who spoke a different dialect in the Caucasus, based on Yerevan, and those in the West who based their language on Istanbul. For the next, but the great division, and the one that would shape where the diaspora is today, came not so much between urban Armenians, as in Istanbul, and rural villagers in Anatolia, which was one great division, or between Eastern and Western Armenians, but between those in the 20th century who recognized and favored the Armenian state as it existed in the 20th century, namely Soviet Armenia, and those, the great majority of the diaspora, who were opposed to the Soviet state. This is a fundamental and key event, often left out of Armenian history. It's embarrassing to many Armenians, but it really shapes where Armenians came from and what they are today, it seems to me, in the diaspora. Armenians, in other words, had different, in the 20th century, after the genocide of 1915, and then after the formation of Soviet Armenia in late 1920, they had two imagined homelands. One was the one they had lost in Eastern Anatolia, and the other was the state that existed in the Soviet Union. And it's that state in the Soviet Union that many of them felt most uncomfortable with. So for 70 years of the 20th century, the Armenian question was posed in a new form. Was Armenia to be Soviet and tied, therefore, to another empire, that of communist Russia, or was it possible at some future moment for Armenia to be independent, reunited perhaps with lost lands in Eastern Anatolia, and sovereign under an independent government? Now, this choice was an extraordinarily difficult one for diaspora Armenians. First of all, only about 30% of the world's Armenians live in the Armenian Republic. Another 20 or 25% live in other parts of the former Soviet Union, and somewhere about over 1/3 of all Armenians live in the diaspora outside of the USSR. Growing communities in the United States, to some extent in France, in Argentina, many of the communities in the Middle East, in Istanbul, in Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt have been declining. The great majority of Armenians outside of the homeland preferred some or any alternative to the often harsh socialist, I put that in quotes, regime established in Yerevan in the 1920s. And so in the diaspora, two dominant discourses developed. One accepting Soviet Armenia as legitimate and as the only possible Armenia to exist. It seemed that was the reality. Russia could protect Armenia, Turkey was an eternal enemy, this is part of that discourse, and therefore we had to go with the Russians and the Soviets. The other, and this was a much more dominant discourse, rejected Soviet Armenia as a pseudo-state. I can remember as a young child being told there is no Armenia today, even though there was a Soviet Armenia, and my family was a left-wing family. There wasn't one of my family who said that, it was someone else. And that the Armenia, Soviet Armenia could not embody real Armenian national aspirations. Even when people recognized that without Soviet protection, the Armenians may have ceased to exist on any portion of the Armenian plateau, a large part of the Armenian diaspora maintained cultural and political distance from their brethren inside the Soviet Union. And of course, for many decades, particularly during the Stalinist years and well into the 1960s, it was impossible even to travel, to associate, to see Soviet Armenia. The dominant political party in the West, in the diaspora, particularly in the Middle East, was that old Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Dashnag Sutyun, which had ruled Armenia briefly from 1918 to 1920, and it engaged at different times in more or less active resistance against the Soviet system. And though by the 1970s the party had accommodated itself to the persistence of Soviet power, this legacy of anti-Soviet antagonism never completely faded. So, if there's an Armenian Zionism, if there's, so to speak, a movement back to Armenia, that always remained a minority movement. Now, there were times in the 1920s, just after World War II, when there were still good feelings about the Soviet Union, because after all, the Soviet Union, let's not forget, was the power that defeated fascism in Europe. Americans don't seem to recognize that, but in general, that's true. They fought 3/4 of the Nazi forces and lost 27 million people in the effort. The Soviet Union was somewhat popular, and some tens of thousands, if not 100,000 Armenians returned to Armenia, returned in quotes, of course, same way Jews returned to Palestine, returned to Armenia in those years, only to find that it was a devastated and poor country. They were persecuted, many of them ended up in exile, and spent the rest of their lives trying to get back to France or Beirut or wherever they came from. So Armenians then, for the great bulk of the 20th century, remained a fractured people, pulled apart by the Cold War division of East and West. Now, while these attitudes towards Soviet Armenia were central to Armenian identities in this period, they were already deeply embedded in other orientations. Diaspora Armenians were pulled from one side to the other by sometimes identifying with ethnicity and sometimes religious culture, sometimes attracted to the foreign cultures within which they lived, the odars. Odar is a word that's related to the English other. Armenian is an Indo-European language, meaning the other, the non-Armenian, and sometimes rejection of that culture. Particularly in the Middle East, in Arab countries, there's a greater distance from the local culture. In Europe, and particularly in the United States, there's more of kind of assimilation that takes place. Armenians divided into sort of 3 different groups, if I can be somewhat crude in my sociology. There were Armenians who rejected any involvement with the dominant culture, lived almost entirely within the Armenian community, as in Beirut to a large extent. They felt their Armenianness to be something natural, not chosen, or as an obligation that should never be questioned. The logic of that position, of course, would be eventually Hayrene Dartsutyun, the return to the fatherland. But there were these political differences with the Soviet regime, and therefore you couldn't carry out, or many wouldn't carry out, that return. At the other extreme, from those who lived exclusively in an Armenian community, there were Armenians who gave up completely their ties to ethnic culture, and acculturated and assimilated into the dominant culture. For instance, in my own country, in the United States, in the years before independence, intermarriage between Armenians and non-Armenians reached levels of 90%. I married an Armenian. I married a student of mine who was Armenian. I probably would be exiled from the university for that nowadays, but this was another time. And we lasted 38 years, so we're doing fine. But my sister married a Greek. And this was, for some Armenians, a betrayal. Not for my grandmother. My grandmother, I asked her, I said, you know, Costa is a Greek and from Samos, and how do you feel about that? And she said, oh, Armenians, Greeks, same thing. In the middle, between these two groups, there are Armenians who have adopted their ethnicity as a kind of symbolic ethnicity. That is, they love being Armenian, they try to learn the language, they learn the music, the dancing, they cook the food, and so forth. They may be involved in politics one way or another. So there are different degrees of allegiance to the community, and in each of these different fragments of the community, there are all kinds of accusations about who's a true Armenian, who's authentic. In other words, there's a lot of ethnic policing that goes on among Armenians. If you don't know the language, you're not a true Armenian. If you don't go to church, you're not a true Armenian. If you're not involved in political movements, if you don't demonstrate, if you don't hate Turks, you're not a true Armenian. All of these things go on. So, for some, Armenians are part of your blood. For some, it's a voluntary association. You can see the development of Armenian communities, diaspora, how a diaspora community would be formed in the history, which I'll give you very briefly, of the community in Beirut. Now, we don't know exactly how many Armenians were actually killed or deported by the Turkish Young Turk deportations and massacres that ranged roughly from 1915 through the early Kemalist period in 1922. 600,000 perhaps, 1.5 million, it's hard to say. Let me quote, by the way, one demographer, Justin McCarthy. Some will find that strange that I'm quoting him. Justin McCarthy is a demographer sympathetic to Turkish denial of the genocide. But these are his figures, and they're very revealing. Muslims made up 83% of the Anatolian population in 1912, 13,700,000. And 83%. In 1922, they had risen to 97.4%, 11,200,000. They suffered a decline in population during World War I of 18.5%. Non-Muslims in Anatolia in 1912 were 17%, almost 3 million. In 1922, they were 2.6%. They had dropped 89.2%. Some people claim there was a civil war between Muslims but the Muslims did rather well. Hundreds of thousands of these